The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets of Springfield into narrow rivers of reflection. Headlights glimmered on wet asphalt, and traffic lights painted the puddles red and green. It was close to midnight when Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore finally left the courthouse. The day had been long and tense. An important case about police accountability had dragged into late evening. He was exhausted, his mind heavy with the weight of decisions that shaped the country. He didn't look like a man of power that night. He wore no robe, no security detail followed him, and his old sedan looked like any other car on the road. He believed in living simply, even though his position could have given him any luxury he wanted. That modesty was something people admired about him, though he never saw it as a choice. It was just who he was. The city had a strange quietness at that hour. The rain muffled sounds, leaving only the soft hum of engines and the distant wail of a siren now and then. As he drove down Jefferson Avenue, he saw flashing lights ahead. A temporary police checkpoint had been set up, and two officers stood under a streetlight, jackets shining with rain. He slowed down, rolled down his window slightly, and waited as one of them approached. The officer's face was half hidden under the brim of his cap. He looked tired and tense. "License and registration," the officer said sharply without greeting. Daniel reached calmly for his wallet and handed over the documents. "Of course, officer," he said, keeping his tone respectful, but the man didn't look at the papers. His eyes lingered on Daniel's face with suspicion. The second officer, standing near the back of the car, shone his flashlight through the rear window. The beam caught the briefcase on the back seat, a black leather case with the seal of the Supreme Court embossed faintly on it. "What's in the case?" the officer asked from behind. "Just work documents," Daniel replied softly. The first officer frowned. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Daniel hesitated. "May I ask why?" The man's tone hardened. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. Step out of the car now." For a moment, Daniel felt a mix of disbelief and calm surprise. He had seen such encounters 1,000 times, from the bench in reports and testimonies, but never imagined living one himself. He opened the door slowly, careful not to appear defiant. The rain soaked his shoulders as he stood beside the car. The second officer's flashlight swept across him again. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," he ordered. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Officer, I believe there must be some mistake. I'm Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore. My identification is right there." But before he could finish, the first officer cut him off. "I said turn around." The streetlight above flickered. The sound of rain grew louder. A small crowd had started to gather across the street, people taking shelter under a storefront awning, watching. Some raised their phones, recording the scene. Daniel sighed quietly, turning around as asked. He rested his hands on the cold metal of the car. The officer began to pat him down roughly, his movements quick and impatient. "Officer?" Daniel said again, keeping his voice steady. "If you'd just check my ID properly, you'll see." "I've heard that before," the man muttered, cutting him off. The second officer stood awkwardly nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to another. He looked uncertain, glancing from Daniel to his partner. Something about the man in front of them didn't fit the profile of a criminal. His calmness, his quiet dignity, it made the younger officer uneasy, but the senior one pressed on. He pulled Daniel's wallet from his pocket, glanced at the ID without really reading it, and shoved it back. "Fake or not, you're coming in for questioning." Daniel took a slow breath. Inside he felt something breaking, not anger, but a deep familiar sadness. He had spent his life building systems meant to prevent exactly this kind of injustice. He had written opinions about fairness, equality, and due process. And yet here he was, living proof of how fragile those words could be in the hands of the wrong people. "Officer," he said gently, turning slightly to look the man in the eyes. "I understand your duty, but please take a moment to verify my identity. This can be cleared up in seconds." The officer's expression hardened. "I don't need lectures from you. Get in the car." The second officer finally spoke. "Sir, maybe we should double-check." "Quiet," the senior snapped. "You're still on probation. Do what I say." The younger man lowered his gaze, silent again. Daniel felt the cuffs close around his wrists, a cold click that echoed louder in his mind than the rain around them. It wasn't pain that hit him first, it was disbelief. The restraint felt heavy, symbolic. It wasn't just his wrists being bound, It was the idea that even the most respected position in the land couldn't protect a man from prejudice. As they led him toward the patrol car, someone from across the street shouted, "Hey, that's the Chief Justice!" The senior officer turned sharply. "Keep moving!" he barked, pushing Daniel forward, but the words were already spreading. A few people gasped, whispering to each other. Phones stayed raised. The rain fell harder, but no one looked away. Inside the car, Daniel sat silently, his wet coat clinging to his back. The metal cuffs dug slightly into his skin. He looked out the window, watching the blurred lights pass as the car began to move. His thoughts drifted, not to himself, but to the young man sitting in the front seat. He had seen that expression before: fear of disobeying authority, fear of doing what's right when it goes against orders. He remembered his own youth as a lawyer, the first time he defended a man wrongfully accused. He remembered the passion with which he spoke about fairness and integrity. And now, decades later, he was in the same position as that man, a victim of assumption. When they arrived at the small precinct, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The senior officer opened the door and motioned for him to get out. Daniel stepped out carefully, still silent. The younger officer kept glancing at him, guilt flickering across his face. They walked through the dim hallway of the station, past flickering fluorescent lights. A few officers looked up as they entered, curious. The senior officer tossed the papers onto the counter. "Picked him up near Jefferson," he said. "Matches the description." The desk sergeant looked up, eyes narrowing. "Name?" "Daniel Whitmore," the senior officer replied dismissively. There was a pause. The sergeant's expression changed. He leaned forward. "Wait, Daniel Whitmore? As in Chief Justice Whitmore?" The room went quiet. A couple of officers stopped what they were doing and turned. The younger officer looked down at the floor, frozen. "Are you telling me you brought in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in handcuffs?" the sergeant asked slowly. The senior officer's face lost all color. He turned to Daniel, who simply stood there, rain still dripping from his hair. Their eyes met for a brief second. One man's full of shock and regret, the other's calm and unreadable. Daniel spoke softly, almost kindly. "I told you there must have been a mistake." No one moved for a moment. The only sound was the faint dripping of water from Daniel's coat onto the tiled floor. Then the sergeant hurried around the counter, fumbling with the keys to unlock the cuffs. "Your Honor, please, sir, I'm so sorry. We had no idea." Daniel raised a hand gently. "It's all right," he said. "You were doing your job, but I think we both know something went wrong tonight." He turned to the senior officer, who stood speechless, face pale and jaw trembling. The young officer still couldn't look up. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city lights shimmered through the window like faint stars. Daniel looked toward them, silent for a long moment. In that quietness, the weight of what had just happened settled in. The realization that no position, no title, could shield anyone from bias when it went unchecked. He took his wallet from the counter, nodded politely to the sergeant, and walked out of the station without another word. Behind him, the senior officer stood frozen in place, the sound of the door closing echoing through the station. Only then did the young officer finally lift his head, eyes full of regret, knowing that something irreversible had just occurred. Outside, Daniel stepped into the cool night air. The clouds had parted slightly, letting a bit of moonlight spill onto the wet pavement. He walked to his car slowly, his reflection following him in the puddles. For the first time in many years, the Chief Justice felt the sting of the system he had sworn to protect. He started the engine, the quiet hum filling the silence. As he drove away, his mind wasn't angry. It was thoughtful. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this moment would not end tonight. What had just happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror held up to an entire system. And that mirror had shown an ugly truth. The city behind him glowed faintly under the streetlights, unaware that one night's injustice would soon shake the nation. The next morning, the city woke up to a storm of a different kind. The night's rain had washed the streets clean, but it hadn't washed away what had happened on Jefferson Avenue. Someone's phone video of the arrest had already been uploaded online. By sunrise, it had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. The clip was only a minute long, but it was enough. It showed Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore standing in the rain, his voice calm but pleading for reason, while a police officer shouted at him. The image of him being handcuffed, a man who symbolized law and justice, hit people hard. Viewers didn't even need context. The sight alone told the story. By mid-morning, every news outlet had picked it up. Headlines ran across screens. Supreme Court Chief Justice wrongfully detained by police. Viral video sparks public outrage. Accountability under question. Inside his quiet home, Daniel sat at the small dining table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The television was on, volume low, showing a reporter standing outside the same police station he had walked out of just hours before. He didn't move. The steam from his cup faded slowly, forgotten. He had always believed in calm reflection before reaction. But today his thoughts were clouded with something heavier than anger. It was disappointment. Not only in the officer who arrested him, but in the larger system he had spent decades defending. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from colleagues, fellow judges, and even foreign legal figures filled the screen. Some offered sympathy. Others expressed outrage. A few simply asked, "Is it true?" He didn't answer any of them. By noon, reporters had gathered outside his gate. Microphones and cameras waited, hoping he would come out and speak. But Daniel stayed inside. He didn't want to add fuel to what he saw as a dangerous fire. He knew that if he spoke too soon, his words could divide rather than heal. At the same time, the police department was struggling to contain the fallout. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was tense. The precinct's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls, citizens demanding answers, journalists seeking statements, and officials requesting urgent reports. The officer who had made the arrest sat silently in a small room, staring at the floor. His uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt heavy. His superior had ordered him to stay in until internal affairs arrived. He hadn't slept since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment Daniel had looked at him, calm, disappointed, and quietly powerful. The younger officer who had stood by during the arrest sat across from him. He looked nervous, but also relieved that the truth had come out. "I told you we should have checked the ID," he muttered softly. The senior officer didn't respond. His throat felt dry and his mind replayed the sergeant's shocked face from the night before. He had made a mistake, one that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to form. People carried signs demanding justice. Some called for reform, others for resignations. But most were simply angry at what they saw as another example of unchecked power. Inside the media vans, journalists spoke rapidly into microphones. "Public confidence in law enforcement is shaken this morning," one reporter said, after footage surfaced showing the wrongful arrest of Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore. Officials have yet to comment directly on the incident, though sources suggest internal investigations are underway. By evening, the nation's major networks aired full coverage. Talk shows debated what the arrest said about policing culture. Legal experts called it a wake-up call. Politicians issued statements of concern. But through all the noise, Daniel remained silent. That silence made people even more curious. They wanted to hear what he thought, how he felt, what he planned to do, but he didn't give them that satisfaction. Not yet. Instead, he spent the evening walking through his study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with decades of legal history. He ran his fingers along the spines of those volumes, pausing at one, a book he had written years ago, The Measure of Justice. He opened it to a page he remembered well, a paragraph he had once quoted in a lecture. "True justice is not only what the law demands, but what humanity deserves." The words struck him differently now. He closed the book slowly and sat down, letting the quiet fill the room. The next morning, the police department held a press conference. The police chief, looking exhausted, stood behind a podium. "We extend our deepest apologies to Chief Justice Whitmore for the events that occurred. The officers involved have been suspended pending a full investigation. This department does not condone any form of bias or misconduct." Reporters shouted questions. Will the officer be charged? Has the Chief Justice accepted the apology? Was this racially motivated? The chief dodged most of them, giving vague, careful answers. Across the city, Daniel watched the broadcast without expression. His phone rang again. It was the mayor. After a brief hesitation, he answered. "Your Honor," the mayor's voice said, heavy with tension. "Please know the city is deeply sorry. "This incident doesn't reflect who we are. I've ordered a full inquiry," Daniel replied calmly. "It's not about me, Mayor, it's about trust. When people lose faith in justice, we all lose something far greater." There was silence on the other end. The mayor finally said, "We'll do everything we can to make this right." "I hope so," Daniel said quietly, then ended the call. Later that day, Daniel decided to return to the courthouse. His security detail tried to persuade him to stay home, but he refused. "If I hide, it sends the wrong message," he told them. When he arrived, reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. He stopped, adjusted his coat, and spoke calmly. "I appreciate the concern shown by so many," he began. "But this is not about me. It's about a moment that reflects something deeper, something that needs to change. Justice must begin not in our courts, but in our hearts." His voice was steady, his words simple, but they carried weight. The clip of his short statement spread almost as fast as the arrest video itself. Many called it one of the most graceful responses to public humiliation they had ever seen. But behind that composure, Daniel felt a quiet ache. Each night, as the city argued over what had happened, he sat alone thinking about the officer who had cuffed him. He didn't hate him, he pitied him. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what had shaped him. In his mind, Daniel replayed the look on that officer's face at the station, the fear, the disbelief, the regret. He wondered if the man truly understood the depth of what he had done, or if he was simply afraid of losing his job. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses were interviewed. Body cam footage was reviewed. It became clear that the officer had ignored clear evidence of identity, acting on assumption and impatience. The report confirmed what many had already concluded. Bias had played a role. Within a week, protests had spread to nearby cities. They weren't violent, but passionate. People holding signs that read, "No one is above the law, but no one should be beneath it either." At home, Daniel received letters from ordinary citizens. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated or dismissed. Others thanked him for handling the situation with dignity. He read every letter, often late into the night, sometimes stopping to wipe away a tear. He realized that what had happened was no longer just his personal experience. It had become a symbol. People needed it to mean something, to drive change. Yet, for all the attention, Daniel felt isolated. He didn't want to be a hero or a victim. He only wanted to remind the world of what justice was supposed to look like: fair, patient, humane. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested him stayed at home on suspension. The media had revealed his name and public opinion was harsh. He received threats and his neighbors avoided him. He watched news clips of Daniel speaking, and each word cut deeper. For the first time in years, he questioned himself, not just his actions that night, but his beliefs, his training, the way he saw people. Regret settled in slowly, heavy as the rain that had fallen that night. One evening, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. He began to write a letter, not for the media, not for his department, but for the man he had wronged. He didn't know if he'd ever send it, but he needed to write it. "Your Honor," he began, "I can't sleep knowing what I did. I saw you as something you weren't, and I let my own prejudice lead me. I thought I was enforcing the law, but I was only enforcing my own blindness. I'm sorry, not for being caught, but for being wrong." He folded the paper carefully, unsure if courage would ever let him deliver it. Somewhere across town, Daniel stood by his window, looking out at the lights of the city. He had just finished reading another message from a citizen, thanking him for showing restraint and compassion. He looked at his reflection in the glass, tired eyes, calm face, and whispered to himself, "Maybe this had to happen." The world outside moved on, but deep inside, both men, the judge and the officer, were changed forever. One had learned how fragile dignity could be. The other had learned how deeply human regret could feel, and though neither of them knew it yet, their paths were destined to cross again, under very different circumstances. Days passed, but the storm around the incident only grew stronger. Every news channel, every social media feed, every radio talk show seemed to circle around one story. The night a Chief Justice was arrested by mistake. What had started as a simple video had now become a national conversation. People debated it in coffee shops, classrooms, and offices. Some spoke with anger, others with disbelief, but everyone had an opinion. Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore tried to carry on with his daily duties. He arrived at the courthouse each morning, as calm and polite as ever. Yet behind his quiet composure there was a heaviness he couldn't ignore. Every time he walked past a crowd or entered a courtroom, he felt the stares, a mix of sympathy, respect, and sadness. He didn't want to be seen as a victim. He wanted people to look at the bigger picture. For him, this wasn't just about one man being treated unfairly. It was about a mindset that needed to change. Inside the courthouse, his assistants tried to keep the press away, but reporters always found a way. They asked questions he didn't want to answer. Do you forgive the officer? Do you believe this was racial bias? Will you press charges? To all of them, his answer was the same. Justice will speak for itself. It wasn't that he didn't have emotions. He did, deep ones. But years of serving on the bench had taught him patience. He believed the truth always revealed itself in time. Meanwhile, inside the police department, the investigation was nearing its end. A special committee had been formed to review the incident. Officers were questioned, evidence was reviewed, and procedures were analyzed line by line. The senior officer who had arrested Daniel sat through multiple interviews. Each time, his answers were shorter, quieter. The confidence he once had in his uniform was gone. The younger officer who had hesitated that night spoke honestly about what happened. He told the investigators how he had wanted to check the ID but was overruled. He spoke carefully, but his guilt was clear. When the internal report was finally completed, it confirmed what most already believed. There had been no proper verification, no reasonable cause, and clear bias in the officer's actions. The arrest was declared unlawful. The police department tried to act quickly. The chief announced the findings publicly, admitting fault and promising reforms. But the words didn't calm people. To many, it was too little, too late. One afternoon, Daniel received an official letter from the police department. It was an apology signed by the chief himself. The letter called the incident deeply regrettable and promised that steps were being taken to ensure such mistakes never happen again. Daniel read it slowly, then set it aside. Words on paper couldn't erase what happened, and he knew it. That evening, he sat in his study again, the same quiet space that had become his refuge. The sun was setting outside, painting the room in soft orange light. His assistant, a thoughtful middle-aged man who had worked with him for years, knocked softly on the door. "Sir," he said, "the president's office called. They'd like you to attend a press conference tomorrow. They want to show support." Daniel looked up. "Support is appreciated," he said, "but this isn't about me standing next to anyone. It's about reminding everyone that the system belongs to the people, not to those in uniform or on the bench." The assistant nodded, understanding. "Would you like me to decline?" Daniel thought for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "Tell them I'll be there, but I'll speak in my own words." The next day, the city's largest auditorium was filled with reporters and cameras. Government officials, civil rights leaders, and members of the judiciary were all present. The atmosphere was tense yet hopeful. Everyone knew the Chief Justice would be speaking publicly about the incident for the first time. When Daniel took the stage, the crowd went silent. He stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the quiet stretch. Then, in his calm voice, he began. "Over the last week, I have received countless messages," he said. "Messages of outrage, sympathy, and disappointment. People are angry, and they have every right to be. But I want to remind you all of something very simple. Justice is not a weapon. It's a mirror. What happened to me is not just an accident. It's a reflection of something deeper within our society." He paused, scanning the crowd. Cameras flashed, but he didn't flinch. When a man in a uniform sees another human being and cannot see beyond the surface, that is not policing. That is blindness. And when we accept that blindness as normal, we all become part of the problem. The room was still. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. "I do not wish for anger," he continued. "I do not seek punishment. I seek understanding what can change. The officer who arrested me was wrong, yes, but he is not alone in his mistake. He was shaped by a culture that too often values control over compassion." People listened, moved not by anger but by the quiet truth in his tone. "I have spent my life defending the law," he said finally. "But the law means nothing if the people enforcing it forget their humanity." When he stepped away from the podium, The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters rushed to capture his closing words, and within hours the speech had gone viral. Online, people began sharing clips calling it the speech that restored faith in justice. Across the country, students discussed it in classrooms. Police academies began referencing it in ethics training. Even within law enforcement, some officers privately admitted that the Chief Justice's words had made them think differently. But not everyone took it positively. Some voices online criticized him for being too soft, arguing that the officer deserved harsher punishment. Others accused him of turning a personal issue into a moral lecture. Daniel didn't respond to any of it. He had said what he needed to say. A few days later, he received a request that surprised him. The officer who had arrested him had asked to meet, privately. Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no, to let the system handle it. But another part of him, the part that always believed in second chances, agreed. The meeting was arranged quietly in a small conference room at the courthouse. No cameras, no press, just two men in a quiet space. When the officer walked in, he looked almost unrecognizable. His once proud uniform now seemed to hang loosely on him. He kept his eyes down. "Your Honor," he began softly, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to face you." Daniel said nothing at first. He gestured for the man to sit. The officer's voice trembled as he spoke. "I watched that video 100 times. I saw myself, and I didn't like what I saw. I thought I was doing my duty, but I wasn't. I was doing what fear told me to do. I don't know how to fix that." Daniel listened quietly. When the man finally stopped speaking, he said, "You can start by never letting fear guide your judgment again." The officer nodded, eyes filled with regret. "I understand, sir. I'll accept whatever comes next." Daniel stood and looked at him for a long moment. "The law will decide that," he said. "But as for forgiveness, that belongs to a larger world than either of us." The officer lowered his head. "Thank you for hearing me." When he left the room, Daniel stayed behind, staring out the window. He wasn't sure what he felt, sadness, relief, or something in between. But one thing was certain, this meeting would stay with him for the rest of his life. Outside, the world kept moving. The investigation concluded officially a week later. The officer was dismissed from duty. The department announced new training programs focused on empathy and bias awareness. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. For Daniel, life slowly returned to routine. Yet something within him had changed forever. Every time he stepped into his courtroom, he saw things differently. Each case, each face reminded him how fragile fairness could be, and how easily it could be lost. One evening, as he was leaving the courthouse, a young man approached him. "Sir," the young man said, "I watched your speech. It made me want to study law. I want to fix what's broken." Daniel smiled gently. "Then maybe something good came from all this," he said. He walked toward his car as the city lights began to glow. The world was far from perfect, but that night he felt a quiet sense of hope. Perhaps justice, once shaken, could still rise again, not through anger or revenge, but through truth and compassion. He looked up at the sky where the first stars were appearing, and whispered softly, "Maybe this is how change begins." Weeks had passed since the public apology, but the story still refused to fade. Newspapers kept it alive, talk shows still debated it, and the nation continued to wrestle with what it meant. People had turned it into more than just an incident. It had become a symbol, one that forced everyone to look at themselves a little differently. For Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore, life had regained its routine, but not its peace. He still woke before dawn, still worked long hours, still sat through hearings and signed documents, but something deep inside him had changed. The courtroom, once a place of purpose, now felt heavier. Every time he looked at a defendant or a police officer testifying, he saw echoes of that rainy night. He found himself questioning things he'd once accepted as normal. The way officers spoke to citizens in reports, the language of authority that sometimes carried quiet cruelty, the moments of impatience that people overlooked. He had lived long enough to know that change in law was slow, but now he wanted more than change in law. He wanted change in hearts. At home, things were quieter than usual. His wife tried to keep the mood light, talking about ordinary things, but she could sense that his mind was always elsewhere. Some nights she would find him sitting in the dark study, staring out the window, When she asked what he was thinking, he would smile faintly and say, "Just the world." As it is, he had become in a way both more visible and more distant. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Strangers thanked him for his grace, others stopped him to share their own painful stories of bias or unfair treatment. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort but feeling the quiet burden of their trust. Meanwhile, across town, the officer who had arrested him was living in near isolation. His suspension had turned into official dismissal. The department had cut ties cleanly, and his name had become a constant topic of discussion. Some called him a symbol of what was wrong with the system. Others said he was simply a scapegoat, one man carrying the weight of a larger problem. But none of that mattered to him anymore. His world had shrunk to the walls of his small apartment. Days passed in silence. He rarely went outside except for groceries. Sometimes, when he walked by the television, he would catch a clip of the Chief Justice speaking somewhere about reform, equality, understanding, and each word made his chest tighten with guilt. He replayed the arrest over and over in his head. The look on the justice's face, calm but deeply wounded, haunted him. He had apologized once face to face, but it hadn't brought peace. The truth was, forgiveness didn't erase the memory. It stayed like a shadow, always close. Then one day, a letter arrived for him. It was official, an invitation to a new program being launched by the Police Reform Committee. The program aimed to train former officers, even those dismissed, to help develop community trust workshops. It was voluntary, unpaid, but it offered a chance to make something right. At first, he didn't know what to do. He thought, they don't want me there. People will see me as a reminder of failure. But something inside whispered that maybe this was the start of redemption, not for his reputation, but for his own heart. The next week, he showed up quietly at the training center. The coordinator was polite but cautious. He sat in the back during sessions, listening as experts talked about communication, empathy, and responsibility. Every word stung, because it was everything he had failed to do that night. In one session, they showed the video again, the same viral footage of the arrest. The room went silent as it played. The officer stared at the screen, unable to look away. Seeing himself from the outside was almost unbearable. When it ended, the instructor asked for thoughts. He stood up slowly. "That was me," he said quietly. Heads turned. "I was the one who made that arrest. I don't ask for excuses. I just want people to understand that what leads to moments like that is not just one bad decision. It's years of thinking the wrong way, years of not questioning your own fear." The room was silent. Then slowly someone began to clap. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a soft, respectful acknowledgement. For the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe this was how it began, not with forgiveness, but with honesty. Meanwhile, Daniel had begun working with a national commission on justice reform. He was invited to speak at universities and conferences, not as a victim, but as a voice for fairness. His words carried a quiet power because they came from experience. He never spoke in anger. He spoke like a teacher who had seen too much to stay silent. One evening, he was invited to give a talk at a small community event, a gathering of citizens, police, and students. He didn't know that the officer who had once arrested him would be there too, sitting quietly in the back. When Daniel took the stage, the crowd fell silent. He looked around the room, his eyes gentle but sharp. "Change," he said, "is not built by laws alone. It's built by choices, and small choices made every day. How we speak to one another, how we listen, how we see people before judging them." He paused, scanning the crowd. "We've all made mistakes. Some are visible, others are quiet, hidden inside us. But we all share the same duty, to grow beyond them." The officer in the back felt his eyes sting. He wasn't sure if Daniel had seen him, but those words felt directed right at him. After the talk ended, people lined up to thank the Chief Justice. He smiled and shook hands, humble as always. When the crowd thinned, he noticed the officer standing near the exit, hesitant. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then the officer walked forward. "Sir," he said softly, "I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel nodded gently. Life has its ways of bringing lessons full circle. The man took a deep breath. "I've been trying to understand who I was that night. I thought I was protecting people, but now I see I was just protecting my own ignorance." Daniel studied him quietly, then said, "Growth begins when you stop defending your mistakes and start learning from them. You've taken that step." The officer nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "Thank you, sir. I don't know if I'll ever deserve peace, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning it." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture simple but powerful. "Then you already understand justice better than most." That night, as they parted ways, both men carried something lighter in their hearts, not happiness, but a quiet understanding. Over the next months, the reform program expanded. Officers were trained to de-escalate situations, to listen, to understand communities better. Town meetings became more common, where police and citizens spoke openly about their fears and hopes. It wasn't perfect, and change didn't happen overnight, but something real had begun. For the first time in years, people started believing that things could get better. As for Daniel, he continued his work with quiet dedication. His speeches inspired thousands, but he never sought praise. He often said in interviews, "I am not a symbol of injustice. I am a reminder of what happens when respect is lost between people." One evening, after finishing a long day at court, he returned home to find a letter waiting for him. It had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside it read, "Your words gave me something I didn't think I could have again, a purpose. I'm working now with young officers, helping them see people before they see rules. I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can stop someone else from repeating it. Thank you for giving me a second chance to be human." Daniel read it slowly, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his drawer beside a small wooden gavel he had owned for decades. He whispered softly to himself, "Maybe justice is not about punishment after all. Maybe it's about redemption." Outside, the city lights shimmered across the skyline. The same streets that once held a painful memory now carried hope. The rain that night had washed away more than just dirt. It had washed away illusions, leaving behind the truth that change begins with compassion. And somewhere in two different homes, two men who once stood on opposite sides of justice finally found peace. Not through revenge, but through understanding. Time has a strange way of healing and hurting at the same time. Months had passed since the storm that changed two men's lives forever. But the memory of that night still lingered, not as an open wound anymore, but as a quiet scar that neither could forget. Chief Justice Daniel Whitmore had moved forward in his work. The court was busier than ever, and he spent long days reviewing reforms, signing off on new initiatives and speaking at public gatherings about fairness and dignity. On the surface, everything seemed steady, but deep down, he still carried the weight of that night, the humiliation, the disbelief, and the lesson that justice itself could be fragile when humanity was lost. One morning, while he was reviewing a report in his office, his assistant stepped in quietly. "Sir," she said softly, "there's someone asking to see you." "He says it's important." Daniel looked up, curious. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "It's the former officer. The one from that incident." The pen in his hand stopped moving. For a moment he said nothing. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Send him in," he said finally. The door opened a minute later and the man walked in slowly. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a plain shirt worn at the edges and eyes that looked older than his years. The confident posture he once carried was gone. Every step seemed careful, as if he were afraid of making another mistake. "Sir," he began quietly, stopping a few feet away. "Thank you for seeing me." Daniel nodded. "Sit down." The man obeyed, sitting on the edge of the chair like a student before a teacher. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence was heavy but not angry. It was the silence of two people who both knew how much this moment mattered. Finally, the man took a deep breath. "I don't really know how to start," he said. "I've written and rewritten this in my head 100 times, but none of it sounds right." "Just speak," Daniel said gently. He nodded. "That night, I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was protecting people. But now I know I wasn't protecting anyone. I was reacting to my own fear of things I didn't understand, fear of people I didn't know. You tried to tell me who you were and I didn't listen. I saw what I wanted to see, not what was in front of me." Daniel's eyes stayed calm. "And what do you see now?" he asked quietly. The man's voice trembled. "I see a person I wronged. I see the harm I caused. And I see that I spent years thinking authority made me right. It didn't, it made me blind. He looked down at his hands. After I was suspended, I thought about ending everything. Not my life, but everything I believed about who I was. I lost my job. My friends turned away. My own family stopped speaking to me for a while. I deserved that. But then I started working with that reform program. I met people who'd been through worse than me. They helped me see that change isn't just a word. It's a decision, one you make every single day. Daniel listened quietly. There was no judgment in his expression, only a deep stillness as though he were trying to absorb every word. I came here today, the man continued, not because I want forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that what happened changed me. It woke me up. I've been working with young officers trying to help them see people, not profiles. I tell them my story, not to make excuses, but to make sure they never become me. He paused, emotion rising in his throat. But still, every night I see your face. The moment I realized who you were. The shame in my chest. I don't think it'll ever go away. And maybe that's how it should be. Daniel folded his hands, his voice calm but firm. Do you know what justice truly is? The man looked up. I used to think I did. It's not punishment, Daniel said softly. It's truth. It's what happens when a person faces who they really are, and then chooses to become better. That's justice. The man's eyes filled with tears he tried to hold back. I'm trying, he said, his voice breaking. I swear I'm trying, Daniel nodded. I can see that. But understand this, and forgiveness isn't something I give. It's something you earn from yourself. The man bowed his head, a tear falling onto his hand. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself. Then start by forgiving the fear that made you who you were, Daniel replied gently. That's how healing begins. They sat in silence for a moment, both men lost in thought. The past hung between them like a quiet ghost, but for the first time it didn't feel like an enemy. Then Daniel stood up and walked to the window. When I was younger, he said, still looking outside, my father used to tell me that the hardest part of justice is learning when to show mercy. I didn't understand it then. I do now. He turned back toward the man. You've already faced consequences. You've lost your position, your pride, your peace. But if you're truly working to make things better, then you've already begun the path toward mercy. The man stood too, his voice low. Sir, I don't deserve your kindness. Daniel looked him in the eye. Maybe not. But none of us deserve grace, and we just hope to live up to it. For a long time, they stood there, two men bound not by anger anymore, but by a shared understanding of what it means to be human, flawed, fearful, and still capable of change. Before leaving, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is something I wrote for the program, he said quietly. It's a message for new recruits. I wanted you to have a copy. Daniel accepted it silently. The man hesitated at the door, then looked back one last time. Thank you for hearing me. Even if you never forgive me, thank you for listening. After he left, Daniel unfolded the paper. It was a single page, handwritten in uneven ink. It read, Authority without empathy is a weapon. Justice without compassion is hollow. Every badge, every robe, every title, they mean nothing if you forget the person standing in front of you is human. Daniel stared at the words for a long time. Then he placed the letter in his drawer beside the others. Reminders of lessons learned not through books but through pain. That evening, as he drove home, he thought about what forgiveness really meant. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing not to let the past poison the future. At home, his wife noticed a calmness in him she hadn't seen for months. You look lighter today, she said with a small smile. He nodded. Someone reminded me that justice isn't just something you deliver in a courtroom. It's something you live every day. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She simply reached out and held his hand. That night, rain began to fall again, softly like the night of the arrest. But this time it felt different. It wasn't the sound of conflict. It was the sound of renewal, of something painful finally beginning to heal. The next morning, Daniel attended a community seminar on law and empathy. As he spoke to the audience, he said something that lingered in everyone's mind long after the event ended. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a verdict. But the truest form of justice, he said, is when a person changes who they are after seeing the truth. Forgiveness doesn't erase wrongs, and it transforms them. In the audience, the same former officer sat quietly in the back, just listening. He didn't approach the stage this time. He didn't need to. He knew that in some way the Chief Justice's words were for him, and that was enough. As people applauded, the two men's eyes met briefly across the room. No words were exchanged. No gestures. Just a shared understanding that both of them had come through the fire and found something worth holding on to. Humility. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunlight broke through the clouds, spreading over the courthouse steps. For the first time in a long while, both men felt free, not from judgment, but from the weight of what had once been unforgivable. It wasn't forgiveness in the way people imagined it. It was something deeper, quieter, more human. It was the beginning of peace.